Within a nondescript, dank and musty room, a family sat and wept. The tears of the frail mother fell onto a dirty floor. The sobs of the malnourished daughter echoed against the grimy metal walls. The son had already left for work, wanting to be on time for his shift. And the husband, the father, lay still. For in this small, dark, normal, pathetic excuse of an abode, he had drawn his last putrid breath and sadly passed away. But his duty to the Imperium was not yet finished, for there was one more macabre task that his corpse would perform in aid of the human machine. The mother and daughter shuddered at the reverbed banging on their door, and as they opened it up to expose the foul world outside, the figure of a tall, slim man stood before them. His skin was pale as death itself. He was dressed entirely in black, and behind him a large wooden cart rested, the collected cargo covered by a black sheet stained red. This man had been called for. This man had been expected, although not quite so soon, and this man uttered one simple whispered phrase: "Collect your dead." The dimly lit corridors of Hive Sarcophia's lower levels echoed with the monotonous hum of machinery and the distant wails of unseen souls. The dense air was thick with the acrid scent of decay. The streets, the veins of the city, were clogged with a fatty grime that only humans can leave, and the walls seemed to close in around those who walked them. At the heart of this subterranean labyrinth stood the mortuarium, the seat of the corpse guilds and the final destination for Hive Sarcophia's dead. Rankle, a seasoned worker of the corpse guild, stood at the entrance of the mortuarium, his features obscured by a respirator and protective goggles. He had long since grown accustomed to the stench of foul blood and rotting flesh, desensitized to the extreme gore of dismembered bodies, exposed innards, and the sight of death. It was merely another grim part of his sorrowful life in the dark underbelly of the Imperium. Today, like every other day, he prepared for the disturbing task that sustained the hive. "Another shipment's in," croaked a voice behind him. It was Jansen, a younger worker with only a few years in the guild. His eyes were already dull, the spark and joy of youthful innocence long snuffed out by the horrors they faced day after day, shift after shift, hour after hour. Rankle nodded, not wasting words. He led Jansen through the heavy iron doors into the loading bay, where the servitors were already unloading heaps of bodies from rusted transport vehicles. Each body, wrapped in tattered shrouds, bore tags indicating their origin, most from the slums, a couple from the wastelands, others from the battlefronts, and a few unfortunate souls who had met their end in the depths of the manufactorums. The first step in the process was sorting. Rankle motioned to Jansen, and they began the grim task of cataloguing the bodies. Each was scanned, their data logged into the cogitators. Those marked with plague or mutation were quickly diverted to the blazing incinerators, for they were far too dangerous to process, even for the corpse guilds. Rankle sighed as he nudged one of the bodies with a gloved hand.
Ugh. Gene stealer cultists.
How can you tell?
Even in death, the skin color retains its purple hue.
Jansen stood over the lifeless body. He appeared interested, but his mind was blank.
You'll see all kinds come through here. Tag him for the incinerator.
Once the initial sorting was complete, the bodies were sent to the preparation chambers. Here the automated systems and guild workers removed whatever tattered or blood-stained clothing the corpses wore, and relieved them of any remaining personal effects. These items were either incinerated, or if valuable, sent to the upper levels for redistribution. The workers would never benefit from any such items. Those that dared the arrogance to try would quickly find themselves harshly punished, or worse, among the processed dead. The stripped bodies, now reduced to mere meat, were loaded onto conveyor belts that led deeper into the mortuarium. Rankle followed the belts, his eyes sweeping over the endless procession of corpses. He couldn't help but feel a pang of melancholy. Each body represented a life lived, now reduced to mere resources for the hive's survival. But such sentiments were dangerous in their line of work, and he quickly suppressed them. In the sweltering rendering halls, the real work began. Massive mechanical arms tipped with serrated blades descended upon the bodies. With brutal efficiency, they severed limbs, decapitated heads, and split torsos. The room was filled with the wet sounds of flesh being shredded, tendons and ligaments ripped and snapped, bones being cracked and torn apart, the air thick with a coppery scent of blood. Workers, clad in heavy aprons and masks, operated the machines with practiced precision, ensuring no part of the body was wasted. Rankle took his position at one of the control panels, overseeing the process. His hands moved deftly, adjusting settings and monitoring the flow of bodies through the machines. The severed limbs and torsos were then funneled into the grinders, enormous devices that pulverized the flesh and bone into a thick, crimson slurry. This slurry was then pumped into massive vats, where it would undergo further processing. Jansen, stationed nearby, managed the waste disposal units. Despite the efficiency of their machines, there were always parts that couldn't be used, pieces too small, too contaminated, or too damaged. These were incinerated in roaring furnaces, their ashes collected for use in other industrial processes. No part of the human machine was truly wasted here. Now, once the bodies were reduced to a thick jam-like consistency, it was time for the refining process. The slurry was transferred to the purification chambers, where it was subjected to intense heat and pressure. This process separated the usable organic material from impurities and removed the excess water. What remained was a thick, nutrient-rich paste. It was the base for corpse starch. Rankle watched the gauges carefully, ensuring the temperatures and pressures stayed within the optimal range. The purification process was delicate. A slight miscalculation could ruin an entire batch, but he was experienced, and his hands moved with the confidence of years spent in the mortuarium. Jansen studied Rankle's work, paid attention to the nuances of his actions, for one day soon he would take his place, working solitary, unassisted, unmonitored, alone amongst the dead. After purification, the paste was channeled into the final processing units. Here it was mixed with preservatives and stabilizers, substances designed to ensure the corpse starch would remain edible and safe for consumption for extended periods. The mixture was then spread onto large drying racks and subjected to intense artificial sunlight. This final step dehydrated the paste, transforming it into the familiar, chalky substance known as corpse starch. As the racks moved through the drying chambers, Rankle took a moment to rest. He removed his goggles, revealing tired, bloodshot eyes. The day's work was grueling, and it would be repeated over and over and over again. But it was necessary. The hive depended on the corpse guilds. Without them, starvation would sweep through the population in weeks, and the repercussions would climb to the very top spires of Sarcophia. Jansen approached, his face ashen, downtrodden. It was a standard feature of the underbelly populace. "How do you do it, Rankle?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do you keep going?" Rankle sighed, replacing his goggles.
We do what we must to survive. It's not about what we do, but why we do it. The Emperor demands sacrifice, and this is ours.
Jansen nodded, though his expression remained troubled. Rankle knew the young recruit would either come to terms with their work or be consumed by it. It was a fate that awaited all who toiled in the mortuarium. Accepting your place in the great cog of the human machine was a tough pill to swallow, There were other options, of course. Run away or take your own life. Either way, you always ended up back in the hands of the Corpse Guild. The only real question is, would you be lying down, processed by the machines, or standing up, operating them? As the drying process completed, the corpse starch was collected and packed into containers, ready to be shipped out of the hive's upper levels. Rankle oversaw the final stages, ensuring each container was sealed and labeled correctly. The containers were then loaded onto transport vehicles, destined for distribution points throughout the hive. With the day's work nearly done, Rankle took one last look at the mortuarium. The endless cycle of death and processing was a grim reflection of the Imperium itself, a relentless machine consuming all in its path to ensure its survival as it spread throughout the galaxy, world after world, hive after hive. He felt a fleeting moment of pride in his work. Despite the horror, they were ensuring the continued existence of humanity, one corpse at a time. For Rankle had accepted his place in the Imperium, and as the transport vehicles rumbled away, Rankle turned back to the loading bay. Another shipment would arrive soon, and the cycle would begin anew. He steeled himself for the work ahead, knowing that in this grim darkness they lived in, there was no room for rest, only the unending toil of survival. Finally, when his shift was done, Jansen removed his work gear and readied himself for the journey home. But before he left, he was offered with a special gift, a tradition that had long stood in this mortuarium. And when Jansen knocked upon the metal hatch that led to his family abode, his frail mother opened the door. His malnourished sister stood behind her, still sobbing. Jansen, the son, looked down at the gift in his hands. It was a tin of corpse starch. It was a small, simple offering. But more than that, it was his father.